Hello, this is Steve Strigham speaking to you from Alaska. For the next hour, I'll be sharing with you excerpts from some of my books. Beauty Within the Beast, Alaska Magnum Bear Safety Manual, When Bears Whisper, Do You Listen?, The Phantom Grizzly, Nearly Breakfast for a Grizzly Bear, and The Language of Bears. These books contain stories of strange and wonderful creatures in strange and fierce realms near the top of the world. Stories of terrible, bone-chilling winters and bone-cracking beasts, and of fierce battles to protect them all from the ravages of industry and climate change. Stories to thrill, stories to sadden, stories to anger, and stories to inspire. Fortunately, people from around the world have banded together to help us curb these impacts. On the scientific side, there are the International Bear Association and Polar Bears International. We have also received great help from numerous conservation groups, which the Alaska Wildlife Alliance and the Alaska Wilderness League have played major roles. My thanks to you, Hillary, and to the League for your invitation to do this webinar. I deeply appreciate the efforts by Adam Colton and other members of the Alaska Wilderness League in helping us conserve Alaska's wild heritage. Long-term welfare of bear populations depends on how they interact with one another and with people, as well as on their successes or failures in foraging and catching salmon, the subjects of tonight's webinar. Please join me now as we embark on a flight of imagination and adventure. Quickly rising up from sea level, we approach the toe of a glacier, an eternal river of ice half a mile wide and several miles long. At low elevations, where all snow has melted away, the ice has a turquoise glow. At higher elevation, the snow is so deep over the ice that it buries all but the peaks of the tallest mountains. Speaking of flights, last month I flew from Alaska down to Southern California to visit my mother. She's more than 100 years old and still as sharp as a needle. Flying from Alaska to California was not just a trip covering nearly 2,000 miles. It was also like riding a time machine from winter back into summer. But a much deeper trip back in time began when Mom started regaling me with stories about her life in the remote wilderness during my infancy. Back then, just after World War II, Dad had a small gold mine. We lived in a cabin near the mine. Its small porch became my outdoor playpen. To prevent me from crawling away, Dad installed railings around the porch. Although the porch was small, I didn't really need much space. It was big enough for me to crawl around and ride my rocking horse. Mom told me that I'd rock and rock for hours, sometimes falling asleep on it. That's also where I had my first bear encounter. When the bear came visiting, I was likely either crawling around or rocking. Although Mom checked on me every few minutes, she never saw the bear, but when Dad came in from his gold mine for coffee, he saw black bear tracks leading to the cabin. Tracks surrounded the porch where I had been playing, revealing that the bear had investigated me closely. Some bears might be man-eaters, but fortunately I wasn't yet a man at the time, just a toddler. If this was one of those rare predatory bears, well, if my diapers might have ruined its appetite for baby food. In any event, it wandered off without bothering me in the least. Nevertheless, fearing that the bear might return in a less benign mood, my folks became ever more careful about not leaving me outdoors alone. Fortunately, in those days, parents didn't have their worries exaggerated by the kind of photoshopped fake news that intensifies fear nowadays. Given my love of horses, at least wooden ones, my parents might have predicted that I'd grow up aspiring to be a cowboy. But they never would have guessed that I'd become a wildlife biologist devoted to studying and conserving bears. For most of the past half-century, my principal goal has been to deeply understand bears, much as Jane Goodall and her colleagues have done with primates. Deep understanding is not just a matter of intellectual knowledge, it's also a matter of one-on-one experiences with wildlife. My relationship with bears is perhaps best expressed by my verse, Renewal. In part because bears can be so dangerous, they force you to pay attention. The awe of being in their presence strips away the chaos of thoughts and distractions that normally dominate your consciousness. They focus your attention on the moment. They flood your blood with adrenaline and endorphins. They introduce you to terror, awe, amazement, and ecstasy. They connect you to the deepest pulses of life. This is their gift, the power to take your life or to renew it, to recreate who you are, if only for a moment, and perhaps for a lifetime. You'll recall my early passion for rocking. Well, it didn't end with childhood, although I switched from rocking horses to rocking chairs. This is one of many traits which I share with grizzly bears. One day when I was hiking, I sat down to rest on a log which hung out over a small ridge. It was so well balanced that when I sat down, It tipped down in my direction. Amused, I started rocking it up and down, up and down. I'd been doing that for just a few minutes before two grizzlies hurried over, signaled me to move aside, which I did, whereupon they mounted the log and started playing on it. This is actually a fairly common game that bears play, usually just cubs, but occasionally adolescents too. Much of my professional life has been spent working to minimize human impacts on bears, for instance through limiting fragmentation of their populations and habitats. Yet my greatest passion is studying bear-bear relationships, such as maternal care, behavioral development, and aggression. The better we understand how bears manage to coexist with one another in relative peace, the more skillful we should become at living with them in relative peace. That knowledge is shared through scientific articles and books, popular books, visits to K-12 classrooms, teaching college courses, and guiding bear viewers. The motto of our bear viewing association is to watch, to wonder, and to conserve. For more than 30 years, my primary partners in crime have been my wife Jackie and our friend and mentor, the Zen naturalist and tracker, Susan Morse. She gave last month's beautiful webinar about her observations on caribou across the high latitudes of this continent. My first grizzly bear encounter occurred one day when I was out hiking and didn't make it back to camp before nightfall. Along the way, I thought I caught sight of a grizzly following me, but moving clouds made the moonlight flicker so much that I couldn't be sure that it was anything but a figment of my imagination. These photos have been darkened to give you a rough idea of what I thought I saw. I had no way of knowing why a grizzly would be following me, unless it was sizing me up for a midnight snack, so I wasn't exactly pleased with the situation. All doubt about this being a grizzly ended when I crested a ridge and saw a camp, where a bonfire was blazing to guide me in. My relief at that sight wasn't shared by the bear, which roared in fury. I got a similar warm unwelcome from some of the bears I encountered along the coast of Katmai National Park when I went ashore there for a few days. That was during June of 1972, before Katmai was a park and hunting was probably fairly common. By training I was a marine biologist, eager to study how bears foraged on razor clams and other invertebrates, as well as salmon. However, first things first, most of the bears I encountered were highly stressed by my presence, jaw-popping, huffing, charging me, and swatting the ground with their paws. Those threats were all symptoms of fear. Before I could do research there, I would have to win their trust and respect sufficiently that they would learn to ignore me while they went around their lives as if I wasn't there. The question was how? Stan Price had lived for years among coastal brown bears without being injured. That was in southeast Alaska on Admiralty Island. How had he managed that when so many other people had been mauled by bears? Could I duplicate his feat on Katmai Coast? Back then in 1972, there were no books on bear safety, and most safety advice was questionable, such as waving your hands overhead to let a bear know you're human. I mentioned this dilemma to Professor Fred Dean at the University of Alaska, where I was earning my master's degree in wildlife management. Fred shared my concerns. He had already concluded that someone should do a study of bear-bear and bear-human interactions at Katmai, although not on the east coast, but at Brooks River in the center of the park. A Park Service biologist flew me to Brooks Camp. After landing on the beach at Naknek Lake, we had to dodge bears while hiking a few hundred yards, Park Service headquarters and then to Brooks Camp. At the time, as I've said, there were no books on bear safety, and most of the so-called wisdom on the subject was half guesswork or superstition. With so little good information to guide me, I made a lot of mistakes, sometimes putting myself in danger unnecessarily, and at other times grossly exaggerating risk. Looking back, I have to chuckle at how clueless we all were half a century ago. Wisdom is the product of trial and error, not its precursor. I set up my tent in the Park Service campground. Then I cooked a pot of dried beans, a food which I hoped would not attract bears. Afterwards, I cleaned up my cooking gear and dishes in the nearby lake, then sat making notes. A 2-year-old female brown bear that I called Nitzy ambled over and searched for food scraps in my fire. Finding nothing of interest, she ambled away, headed for Brooks Lodge, where garbage cans often had food she could scavenge. Not long after, I crawled into my tent and went to sleep. But I didn't sleep for long. I awoke as a bear outside my tent nosed and pawed at the fabric. Looking out through the open door, I saw my visitor was Nitzy, the same adolescent female which had checked out my fire pit. Although she was easily shooed away, I feared that she would return. I knew that campers in other regions had been attacked in their tents by bears, and I was terrified it might happen to me too. But I got lucky. No bear attacked. However, when I woke around 4 a.m. in the third morning, Nitsy was gnawing on the wall of my tent about 4 inches from my face. But for the tent wall, she might well have been gnawing on me. That was my last night in the tent. For the rest of my study, I bedded down inside the maintenance cabin, which looked a bit like this one. Sleeping on the floor, my thin foam pad didn't provide much comfort, but 4 stout walls surely did. Interactions among bears were best observed at Brooks Falls, where it was possible sometimes to see 2 or more bears fishing or fighting over fish. Each year, hundreds of thousands of fish ascend Brooks River. Travel upstream is easy until they reach the falls. Getting over the falls requires leaping over 2 yards into the air. Salmon that make the leap sometimes fly right into the jaws of a bear. Those that fail fall backwards where other bears are waiting to snatch them up. Tent camping was only one bear safety concern at Brooks River. The river was a mecca for anglers, and bears weren't shy about trying to scare anglers into surrendering their fish. A second concern was surprise encounters on a trail or in the forest. Perhaps scariest of all was the thought of an innocent angler or viewer being attacked by a mother bear who mistook the person for an enemy, just as she might attack an adult male. So I was exceedingly cautious around any mother with cubs. One mother was especially protective. Anyone who approached her or who failed to move aside as she approached them was likely to be threatened with nervous huffing and jaw-popping. Yet she was so beautiful that I called her the Alaskan Madonna. Although she threatened me several times during my first week at Brooks, she eventually came to trust me. In fact, she came to trust me so much that she freely nursed her cub even when I was within 50 yards. She not only tolerated my proximity, but sought it, as though she felt safest from the big males when near me. When that first happened, I thought she was simply ignoring having me nearby, but after it happened repeatedly with her and other mothers, I realized that mothers which trust people actually seek us out or our towns in order to avoid cub-hungry large males, which are much shyer towards people. One of my most amazing encounters began as one of the most frightening. As I sat on the bank of a stream, a mother grizzly and cub appeared walking beside the water. They seemed to ignore me until they were about 10 feet away. Suddenly the mother turned and started toward me. I went from being relaxed and happy to terrified in the blink of an eye, fearing that I had somehow offended the grizzly. But instead of charging me, she continued walking, passing within 6 feet of me. Then she and the cub lay down about 10 feet away. To my amazement, the mother lay down facing away from me, with her cub between us, facing me, and both were fast asleep. Not only didn't this mother fear me, but she apparently expected me to alert her in case of danger from another bear or a wolf. Over an hour later, the cub awoke. Rolling onto his back, he pawed the air in my direction, a bear's invitation to play. However, having played with orphan black bear cubs, I knew all too well how hard cubs could bite, especially when they get excited. Furthermore, even if the cub would have enjoyed using me as his shoe toy, his mother might have objected rather strongly. Thanks, but no thanks, little fella. Other than 3 orphan cubs that I mentored in the Alaska wilds, I have never played with wild bears, but I have with captives. Here's some footage from Wild Haven Rehab Center in California. When cubs had become so foul-tempered that they bit anyone who frustrated them, I was called in to teach them better manners. I began playing with the cubs until one of them started biting me. Then I grabbed his jaws and squeezed his cheeks between them, so that when he tried to bite me, he bit himself. It worked wonders for me and then for his keepers. Within 15 minutes, these smart little animals had learned to bite more gently. As one cub climbs the ladder, note how he bites the keeper's hand, whereupon she pulls him off the ladder and squeezes his cheeks. The second keeper used the same technique with another cub. Years passed before I could return to Katmai Coast and resume research. It was one of my favorite places on Earth. I particularly loved Hallow Bay, with its cloud-busting peaks, its huge glacier, its abundance of bears, and its scarcity of other people. Back in the 1990s, I often had the bay to myself for up to a week at a time. Unfortunately, the bay has become so popular that it can be flooded with more than 100 viewers and a dozen planes a day. Once the bears and I established mutual trust and respect, vast new horizons opened for the understanding of these amazing animals. Each year I financed my visits to Katmai by guiding recreational viewers for Katmai Coastal Bear Tours, owned by my good friend Captain John Rogers. I occasionally traveled there from the Kenai Peninsula aboard John's boat, the marine vessel Waters. Often I flew in by bush plane, then moved aboard John's boat. From the moment we arrived ashore, we had to keep our eyes open for bears. They seemed to pop up out of nowhere, eager to investigate us and our gear. Upon arriving ashore, one of the first things I did was to set up an electric fence, inside of which I could store all of my gear and supplies until they could be hauled to my campsite. Anything not protected by an electric fence was fair game for bears. Their curiosity and playfulness could destroy a camera or a tent in mere seconds. After a week or two of guiding, I was free to go off on my own doing research. I usually came loaded with around 600 pounds of equipment and supplies, so that I could be entirely self-sufficient till the boat returned for me about 6 weeks later. During my first years on the coast, I carried everything on a backpack. That meant 10 round trips of up to 2 miles long, carrying 60 pounds at a time. The task required me to wade through streams and bogs or cross meadows. At high tide, one river was so deep that the water was over my head. To get breaths while walking across the stream with so much weight on my back, I had to jump up every 30 seconds or so to raise my mouth above water level. After completing one trip to my campsite, I discovered that I had lost one of the bungee cords used to fasten gear and supplies to my packboard. After strapping on another load, I headed back for camp, continually searching the ground for my missing bungee. But searching was fruitless, since the bungee had already been found by somebody else. Or should I say something else? A pair of 2-year-old bear cubs. They'd been weaned by the mother and begun life on their own just a few weeks earlier. As I watched, they wrapped themselves up in the bungee, or had tugging matches with it. Time and time again they'd stretch the bungee out between them until it broke loose and snapped. Each time a cub got snapped, it reacted a little bit as though it had been snake bit. Making all those trips, then setting up camp, sometimes took more than 24 hours of continual effort, by which time I was so tired that I could barely stagger. More than once, soaked to the skin from river crossings or rain, I just crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep before my electric fence was operational. Each time, nocturnal visits by bears reminded me of how foolish that was. Although none of them ever damaged my tent, much less attacked me, I was once again nearly paralyzed by fear. Finally I got smart. I got a raft. I could haul all my gear and supplies in a single trip with minimal effort. Also, now having to make only one trip in one direction reduced any disturbance to bears. Wherever possible, I set up camp where it was hidden from view of bears and of any other viewers, and covered my tents with a camo tarp. By contrast, some people use brightly colored tents that could be seen from hundreds of yards away. These not only attracted bears, but marred the viewscape for anyone else taking photos. As usual, I spent the summer of 2003 camping out to study bear behavior and ecology. After a couple of weeks of constant rain or overcast, the sun finally began to shine. By then I smelled like an old billy goat, so down to the creek and rub-a-dub-dub. I bathed myself and scrubbed my clothes. After hanging the laundry in bushes to dry, I figured I'd settle down for a nice nap. But no such luck. Out of the surrounding forest came a sow brown bear, who apparently thought I hadn't done a good enough job. After giving my laundry a sniff and a snort, she rubbed each piece with her head, trying to cover my scent with hers. When rubbing my laundry on the branches didn't suffice, she pulled each piece of clothing off the bushes and dropped it onto the grass, where she vigorously rubbed it with her head. Rubbing the laundry with her head apparently didn't cover my human odor well enough, so she rolled on everything till it was thoroughly anointed with her own God-given perfume. You'll recall the incident from my infancy, when the stink of my diapers may have repelled a black bear. By contrast, some bears might be attracted to the odor of freshly washed underwear, or at least the odor of the soap with which I washed my clothing and myself. Finally satisfied, the bear ambled off and settled down for her own siesta. Waiting until she was snoring gently, I crept up, retrieved my clothes, and rewashed them. That night, using a satellite phone, I told the story to my wife. She asked why I didn't leave well enough alone and put up with smelling like a bear, perhaps as camouflage. What could I say? This sow was in heat. Getting chased by a dozen randy boars might have been her idea of a good time. It sure wasn't mine. There on the Katmai coast, my safety depended on remaining highly alert to what the various bears were doing, in some cases over 50 of them within 300 yards simultaneously. When salmon were scarce, bears often fought over them. When one bear chased another or attacked it, they might accidentally plow right into any nearby viewers, so I was constantly ready to dodge out of the way. That's why I didn't use a tripod when filming, too awkward to move in an emergency. Likewise, when a bear raced toward me, I had to recognize whether it was charging me or running away from other bears. When a bear ran in my direction and I dodged out of the way, this had the beneficial side effect of convincing it that it was no threat. This was true whether the bear was running toward me to intimidate me or whether simply fleeing from danger and didn't care whether I was on an escape route. Retreating from white ears and her cub Whipple convinced them that I was no threat. You see them in this photo behind me. After a few days, white ears trusted me enough to graze right up to within about 10 yards of me, while keeping Whipple safely behind her. Within an hour, however, she was allowing her cub to approach while she watched carefully. The next stage of her growing trust was standing sideways to me while Whipple came close. Eventually she quit watching at all, letting Whipple come up to within about 5 yards of me even while she was facing away. At first I was reluctant to deter his approaches, for fear that this would upset White Ears. But by the time she was trusting enough to graze facing away from me, I was able to keep him at bay simply by imitating a bear's stress signals, clapping my hands to imitate jaw popping and pant-huffing. This female, whom I called Kara, had known me since she was a cub. When she became a mother herself, she would bring her own cubs to within a few yards of me for resting, sleeping, and nursing. It was flattering to be trusted so much by a mother grizzly, and it provided superb opportunities for close-range observation and filming, but it's not something I encourage. Usually I prefer being ignored by bears. Here you see Kara and her twins approaching me, walking past a couple of yards away, then laying down to nurse, and then to nap. A few hours later, Kara woke and went fishing. Rather than expose her cubs to dangerous adult males, she left them with me, whereupon they soon started playing. All was well until the 4-year-old male called Racer approached us, showing too much interest in the cubs. They might have been safe if they'd remained near me, but the cubs panicked and ran for their mother, who was about 300 yards away. The male cub with a white collar veered off to the right, and I thought Racer would target him. But Racer instead followed the small female and chased it down, biting into the cub's thigh and forcing its body underwater as though trying to drown it. Amazingly, the cub fought back and managed to bite Racer on the nose, whereupon the adolescent male redoubled his attack. That's when Kara came to the rescue. She and Racer kept chasing back and forth for the next several minutes. She could not catch him, but she did force him to bow his head in submission. He abandoned pursuit of the little female and turned his attention back to the little male, who raced back to us for protection, which we had no way of providing. When Racer finally left, the wounded female rejoined her brother. Within the hour, Carr and her cubs followed the rising tide and began fishing near me. Had Racer stayed at least 100 yards away, she probably wouldn't have troubled him any more. However, he got too close, triggering Carr to chase him once more. Luckily for him, he was faster than she was, because hell hath no fury like an enraged mother grizzly bear. With the danger finally quelled, Carl lay down and nursed her cubs, providing at least that small comfort, although she paid no obvious attention to her cubs' wounds. No matter how wary a bear is of the first humans it meets, mother bears and juveniles of both sexes are much more afraid of adult males, some of whom not only bully them, but occasionally try to kill and eat them. So these bears choose the lesser of evils and spend time closer to humans than most adult males are willing to go. When bears spend time near people who welcome them, these bears quit perceiving humans as dangerous predators and occasionally approach people to avoid the adult males. And once a female has cubs, she'll sometimes associate with humans in order to shield them from dangerous adult males, as we've seen. During mating season, estrus females also approach humans to brush off any unwanted suitor who is following them. Of course, this works only until a male also loses its fear of us, as shown in this photo, where a dominant male has followed us all right close to us. Reflecting back over decades of observing bears, I realized that despite all the differences in bear behavior, due to differences in habitats and other factors, a few general principles seem to apply everywhere with most black and brown bears. First, during a close encounter, your safety depends in part on how much the bear trusts and respects people. Trust means that the bear doesn't expect you to behave like a predator and attack without provocation. Respect means that it expects you to retaliate decisively if it dares attack you. Trust inhibits defensive aggression. Respect inhibits offensive aggression. Whether these inhibitions suffice during any given encounter depends on strength of trust and respect, as well as upon strength of the bear's motivation for aggression, for instance, fear, anger, or hunger. A lot of people have gotten into trouble when a bear perceives someone as a rival for prized food that was very attractive but relatively scarce, such as the carcass of a moose which the bear had found and was guarding, or the body of a moose that someone had just killed and was too distracted to keep watch for bears. A whale carcass is also highly prized and can attract numerous bears. But there tends to be little fighting since bears recognize that there's plenty for all. That's why we could safely watch these bears at such close range, a bit over 50 yards away. Likewise, when salmon are abundant and easily caught, there's little aggression among bears, unless towards anglers or other humans. Near my home, on Alaska's Russian River, bears commonly mingle with anglers. Occasionally a bear might catch a salmon that you've hooked and are reeling in, or it might approach you for a salmon you've already landed. But bears that spend a lot of time near people are seldom very demanding, unless extremely hungry, and salmon are scarce or hard to catch. In that event, surrendering the salmon is your surest way of entering the confrontation peacefully. Bears sometimes pass within a few yards of people, or vice versa, in which case the bear usually tends to be calmer and more hesitant than the human. At Alaska's Diving Bear Cove, bears peacefully wade and swim around boats filled with anglers and viewers. All day long, day after day at this cove, bears see people catching fish and hauling them into boats. Bears can also smell fish in the boats. So when a bear approaches a boat and keeps circling it, anglers naturally fear the bear is going to try to climb into their boat or tip it over to get their fish. However, in this case, what the bear really wanted was for the boat to move aside so the bear could scavenge dead fish lying underwater beneath the boat. As soon as the boat moved, the bear submerged and began harvesting salmon carcasses. Bears, which are both well-fed and trusting, tend to be especially tolerant of one another and of humans, even humans who surprise them at close range. Trusting, well-fed bears also tend to be pretty tolerant of people that the bears themselves surprise, so long as the people don't overact, either belligerently or by panicking. By contrast, when bears are quite hungry, For instance, when salmon are scarce or hard to catch, bears are more likely to fight for fish with one another, or rarely to seriously threaten or attack a person. As the ancient Chinese sage Sun Tzu counseled emperors and generals, it's often most cost-effective to win without fighting. That's the same tactic that bears use. They fight mainly when intimidating each other doesn't suffice to settle who would win in a fight. Intimidation is done through threats. Bear's self-confidence and determination, as well as its mood and intentions, can be revealed through its body language. That is, its postures, gestures, facial expressions, vocalizations, and other sounds which we can detect, in addition to scents to which we are oblivious. Although we humans can also intimidate bears, it's important to keep in mind that trying to intimidate a mother defending cubs could provoke her into defensively attacking you. In contrast, intimidation might be your only option if you lack a weapon when facing a predatory bear. The most horrifying attacks occur when a bear sees someone as food. Fortunately, predatory attacks by bears on people are extremely rare. Before you try intimidating a bear, you might want to determine its mood and motivation. Is it aggressive, and if so, is it predatory, bullying, or defensive? Your only clues are likely to be its body language. To learn the details of bear postures, gestures, facial expressions, and other signals, I observe and film bears at close range. Then I review each video clip time and time again, learning how the meaning of each signal differs according to their context. The public's need for that information inspired me to organize a panel discussion in the 1998 International Bear Association Conference. To meet the public need, a video would have to be produced contrasting predatory versus non-predatory aggression. Actual production of the video was led by John Hechtel and Steve Herrero. It's called Staying Safe in Bear Country. The Staying Safe in Bear Country video did a great job of illustrating various patterns of non-predatory aggression, as exemplified by these video clips of bear-bear confrontations. We have seen bears do sometimes attack one another. Most non-predatory disputes are settled with little violence, usually just a few seconds of swatting, pushing, and biting. Even more often, as explained earlier, disputes are settled with just threat or counter-threat via postures, gestures, facial expressions, sound, and possibly odors. To clarify the meaning of postures and gestures like those seen in this presentation, I prepared diagrams. This one shows how posture changes according to the balance between a bear's levels of aggression and its reluctance to fight. Aggression motivates a bear to subdue its opponent. Fear and prudence inhibit fighting. You've probably heard the term bear whisperer, and might think of the whisperer as someone who knows how to talk to bears, someone who knows how to imitate their postures, gestures, facial expressions, and vocalizations. However, human abilities to mimic bear signals is so limited, especially when it comes to facial expressions and odors, that mimicry is only a small part of whispering. The art of whispering is less about what you say to bears than about hearing what they say to you. A bear whisperer isn't someone who whispers to bears, it's someone who pays such close attention to bears that they can detect even a bear's whispers. A whisper is a subtle signal which reveals a bear's mood and intentions. If you pay close attention and respond appropriately, there's little risk of being attacked except during a surprise close encounter. However, if you don't pay attention and the bear becomes frustrated enough to signal much more strongly, your risk of getting into trouble rises. So pay close attention whenever you are around bears. Do most of your viewing with a guide who is an expert in the language of bears. When the Hechtel-Herrero video was produced more than 20 years ago, it presented cutting-edge insights on differences in behavior between bears whose attitude toward humans was predatory versus non-predatory. There is great footage of non-predatory threats, which the video refers to as defensive threats, even though the same signals are used in other stressful situations. By contrast, it's not clear that any of the footage of approaches by the so-called predatory bears were actually predatory, because it's not certain that any videographer has ever filmed a bear approaching someone to eat that person. For example, consider my own footage. In 1994, I encountered an enormous black bear that was eating a smaller black bear. As the cannibal, which I call Black Brugo, finished eating his victim, he turned and started toward me. I know Brugo was predatory toward the smaller bear. Was he also sizing me up as dessert? As Brugo approached me, he seemed almost casual, grabbing a bite of vegetation here or there along the way. Why eat vegetation just after consuming a huge meal of meat? Was it hunger for vegetation or nervous hunger? Or was he trying to lull me until he could get close enough to charge and catch me before I could start my pickup and drive away? Was his approach predatory or not? To this day, I'm still not sure. I am kept filming until prudence dictated that I leave. Now consider the nervous approach by these recently weaned 2-year-olds that I called the Lemon Sisters. During their first weeks on their own, after separating from their mother, they were trying to figure out how to adapt to their new status as among the lowest-ranking bears in the region. Sometimes they tried to dominate other bears, sometimes they were dominated. Occasionally they tried to figure out their relationship with me. At times they sought me out for protection from larger bears. On other occasions they seemed to verge in trying to intimidate me. But mostly their motives were unclear. Here they show signs of both nervousness and curiosity. Here too you will see them eating vegetation in a stressful situation. However, by contrast to Black Brugo, their attitude was definitely not predatory. Although motivation of the Lemon Sisters was unclear, my best judgment was that they wanted to play. Not gentle fun play, but sparring play, like boys wrestling to test their relative strength and agility. Bear cubs spend a lot of time testing each other and practicing behaviors that are also used in fighting, such as biting, clawing, and trying to throw each other in their back. The captive cubs I showed earlier weighed only about 25 pounds each. The orphan cubs that I raised were about the same size when I adopted them. With their sharp teeth and claws, keeping them in line was challenging. Trying to do something similar with twin grizzlies, each weighing more than I did, would have been more than foolish. I would have been chewed up like a rag doll, even if all in fun. Although I tried to shoo them away, as you saw in the last clip, they had no intention of letting me go. To rid myself of their unwanted attention, I had to find another method. Noticing one of the cubs lazily pawing at a long frond of kelp, I got an idea. Picking up the other end of the frond, I wiggled it, stimulating the cub's interest. Memories of being stalked by the phantom grizzly still give me cold chills, because no matter whether he was just curious or predatory, I jumped to the conclusion that he was predatory. In fact, all too many judgments people make about bear aggression are just guesswork, triggered by their own fear. Over the decades since then, I've been followed by other bears, which none was trying to size me up as a snack, except possibly Black Brugo. The Lemon Sisters apparently just wanted to spar with me. Other bears have just been curious. Nevertheless, I'm not really comfortable being followed by a bear, so I try to end it as quickly and gently as possible. No need to blast the bear with pepper spray or bullets. Distraction works just fine. Much as I distracted the Lemon Sisters by wiggling a frond of kelp, I have distracted other bears by wiggling branches or tossing a piece of wood or a ball-shaped fishing float past the bear. Or in one case, I used a moose skull. I'm not sure why that skull interested the bear so much. The moose had been killed by wolves the previous winter. Wolves and bears and birds had gnawed off every scrap of flesh, but maybe there was still a little fat oozing out of the bone. In any event, the bear kept licking the skull and rubbing its head against the skull, much as another bear had rubbed its head against my underwear. You can see bear hair on the skull. In any event, it broke the bear's concentration on me, and it didn't follow when I left. The better that people understand bear communication, the fewer bears will be shot needlessly, and the fewer people will accidentally provoke bears into attacking in self-defense. That's why I'm writing a book, The Language of Bears, and producing a companion video based on decades of filming and other field work. One of the most exciting aspects of bear research involves crawling into bear dens. Some visits were made in spring when the bear was long gone, or during the depths of winter when the bear was hibernating. Although most bears are still asleep when we entered its den, a few have woken up. Believe me, there's no thrill quite like meeting a bear eyeball to eyeball, so close that it can lick your face. Another story told in my Phantom Grizzly book. If the den contains a female likely to give birth, we waited until the cubs could have been several weeks old, so as not to disturb them. Nevertheless, I yearned to see the miracle of birth at first hand with bears, as I had previously done with dogs. At the time, the video equipment necessary for monitoring the birth of wild cubs had not been invented, so I had to make do observing captive bears. The captive bears whose birthing activities I observed were sisters which had been found as orphans and raised by my dear friend and mentor, Gordon Burkhart. When they became too big to be kept anywhere else, they were housed in the Knoxville Zoo. I spent a couple of months during one winter living with them, watching each mother prepare to give birth, then giving birth and caring for her infants. At the zoo, I observed the birth of two bear litters. In the eye of my mind, I can still see steam rising from the hindquarters of the female that I called Susie. Amniotic fluid burst free from her womb and flooded onto the floor of her den. I recall the gentle plopping sound by each of three cubs as they slid out of her body under the cushion of her lower hind leg, and the slurping of her tongue as she gently removed the amniotic sac and licked them dry. Even now, I seem to hear the first mewing balls of her neonates, surprisingly loud for such tiny animals, then the lusty sounds of suckling and the gentle rattle of their purrs. The youngest cubs I have ever held were but hours old, about the same size as newborn husky pups, giving no hint of how large they would grow. I felt the cubs' warm breath on my lips, their downy soft fur on my cheek, and the coolness of their noses against my own. My hands vibrated with their purrs as they sucked on my fingers, vainly seeking milk that fingers cannot provide. I have looked upon the eyes of cubs before their eyes have seen the world, when their lids were sealed shut, blinding them for the first weeks after birth. When those eyes opened, in the dimness of their natal den, where the only light was snow-filtered translucence, I saw their obsidian pupils afloat in irises like sky-blue pools that would one day turn into amber suns, light with the intelligence and curiosity that make bears among the most intriguing creatures on earth. Years passed before invention of video technology that allowed my colleague Lynn Rogers to monitor such events by wild bears in their dens. That I would someday acquire three cubs of my own came as a complete and wonderful surprise. I mentored these cubs for 3 months, helping them learn to fend for themselves in the Alaska wilderness, while they taught me about rapport and coexistence with our ursine kin, about the beauty within the beast. Now I'm going to share with you a few excerpts from my book. Each year throughout North America, black bear cubs are weaned by their mother, usually at an age of about 15 months, whereupon they're called yearlings. Most bears in coastal Alaska catch salmon. A yearling would have seen its mother and other adults catch salmon, but yearlings have rarely learned the art themselves. It can take several years to master. Meanwhile, they must make do with other foods and are often famished during spring and early summer, while berries are scarce. And so it was in 1972 that a 3-year-old female was half starved when she happened upon a cabin inhabited by a man, a woman, and a dog. The bear helped herself to dog food. Her visits delighted the humans. They called her Dottie and fed her food scraps each day. When fall came, Dottie disappeared and was not seen again till the following spring. By that time, Dottie had given birth to 3 cubs. From what the humans could tell, Dottie was a good mother. She not only nursed her cubs as any mother would, but she led her cubs to good forage. She also took them down to nearby creeks to look for salmon and other prey. No doubt, Dottie was also careful to keep her cubs safe from natural hazards, but she wasn't so good about avoiding man-made hazards. When she couldn't find enough natural foods to satisfy her growing family, Dottie brought them back to the cabin where she'd been fed the previous year. When she arrived, nobody was home, so she opened the door, went inside, and helped herself. Without intending harm, Dottie and her cubs quickly trashed the cabin, eating everything they could find. That evening when the humans came home and found the mess, they were furious and frightened. In a vain attempt to keep any bear from getting in again, they placed 2 logs across the entryway. Hours later, when Dottie and her cubs returned for another meal, the humans hid in terror under blankets on their bed as the bears again trashed their cabin, then raked everything out of the cabin into the light, where it could be examined again. This image shows what the cabin looked like, with all the trash the bears had dragged outside. Red arrows point to 1 cub standing beside Dottie, and 2 more cubs up in the tree. Dottie's misbehavior soon led to her being shot. The rifle shot that killed Dottie sent her cubs fleeing. They climbed a tree where they were safe from most predators, the same tactic they had relied on while their mother was alive. Although being in a tree protects cubs from lynx and wolves, it doesn't necessarily keep them safe from eagles if the tree contains their nest. Initially, I had planned to let nature take its course and let the cubs live or die on their own, but eventually empathy took over as loneliness and hunger caused them to bawl loudly, begging Mama to return. The sounds of their distress tore at my heart. I decided that the only way to save these cubs was to capture them. Hiking up the hillside, I followed the sounds of their distress cries until I located them. 2 were in a tree where I wouldn't be able to reach them by climbing. The 3rd cub was in a small conifer that I could climb using boot spikes and a climbing belt. As I ascended the tree, this cub watched without obvious fear. Approaching him cautiously, I lifted a hand gently toward his face and let him lick it. He also tolerated being petted. This went on for a few minutes as I strapped my climbing belt to the tree so that I wouldn't fall when I let go with both hands. As my right hand was stroking the back of the cub's head, I grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and pulled him off the tree. Holding onto the tree with just my legs as it swayed in the wind, I tried to shove the cub into a gunny sack held in my left hand. The opening of the sack kept collapsing as the cub struggled, biting and clawing me. He quickly escaped and climbed the tree to where the trunk was so thin that it would break off under my weight if I tried to follow. For several minutes I was inclined to give up, but doing so would condemn the cub to death by predator or starvation. So I had to find another way to capture him. There was a second much larger conifer nearby. If I could climb it, I could come level with the cub in the initial tree, reach over and grab the little tyke. I was about 50 feet in the air. Rather than climb down my tree, then back up the other one, I decided to cross from one tree to the next up where I was. Easier said than done. As soon as I stepped across, the two trunks sprang apart. I found myself spread-eagled between them, feeling like I was being pulled in half. I couldn't hold on to both trees much longer, or I'd lose my grip on both and fall to my death. So no matter how much I feared letting go with either tree, I had to let go with one of them. Jerking as hard as possible with my right hand, I swung over onto the larger tree, where I slid down its trunk a few body lengths before reaching a branch that stopped my fall. Along the way, rough bark gouged my chest and face, leaving a bloody trail. Not letting such minor injuries slow me down, I quickly ascended my tree to the cub's level. It could go no higher in the smaller tree, so I thought I'd had it trapped. Grabbing the branch beneath the cub, I pulled the two trees together. Up that high, their trunks were thinner and weaker. By gripping one tree with my right leg and the other with my left, I was able to pull the small tree close enough for me to grab the cub a second time, once more trying to shove it into a gunny sack. But once again the cub's teeth and claws won the day. He escaped, climbing up my face and over my head onto the larger tree, which he ascended far beyond my reach. Discouraged in my failure, and certain that the cubs would soon fall prey or starve, I climbed on and went back to the cabin. It had been temporarily abandoned by its owners. They had just gotten new jobs elsewhere and offered to let me live in the cabin as long as I wanted, which would be a good base of operations for saving the cubs, if only I could figure out how to capture them. Anyone listening to this story is probably shaking your head, realizing that I was going about this all wrong. Even if I succeeded in capturing the cubs, where would I put them? Maybe in the cabin until I could build a pen, but life in a small pen would be horrible for them. And how could I possibly afford to feed and care for them? Not a chance. What they really needed was a foster mother who would keep mentoring them in how to live in the wilds and become self-sufficient. With no foster mother available, well, how about a foster father? Maybe not such a bad idea. And if I wasn't going to keep them captive, why capture them at all? They were already used to spending time in the cabin. Instead of trying to force them inside, why not lure them there? For that I needed bait. Hiking a mile to the nearest road, I drove into town. I bought oatmeal, molasses, raisins, and Karo syrup. Once back at the cabin, I cooked up the wash tub full of cereal, then took it up the hill maybe 50 yards. Left it there. Sure enough, it drew the cubs like magnets and they dove right in. I knew that it would not be enough to lure the cubs close to me. I also had to win their trust, despite my futile attempt to capture the one cub by climbing up after him. Best of all would be winning their affection, so they would be bond to me, as I knew other cubs had bonded to human foster parents. That reminded me of a method that sheep ranchers use to foster orphan lambs. They look for a ewe that has lost her own lamb and induce her to adopt the foundling. Of course, the ewe doesn't naturally care for any lamb but her own, so they trick the ewe into thinking the orphan is her own lamb by covering the orphan with the pelt of her lamb. Once the orphan smells like her own lamb, she adopts it. After a few days, the pelt of her own lamb can be removed. She keeps on caring for the orphan. Why not try the same method with these cubs? After their mother was shot, her body was skinned so that her pelt could be delivered to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. But by delaying that delivery a few days, I might use it. I'd wrap the mother bear's pelt around myself so that the cubs would associate my odor with hers. So when I left that huge bowl of cereal for the cubs, I lay down nearby and pulled the mother bear's pelt over me. Well, That method might well quell for sheep, which aren't exactly the brightest animals, but it sure didn't work with these cubs. They detected me immediately and were spooked. The only thing that kept them from running away was hunger. Unfortunately, the cubs hadn't learned to share food, so they spent more time fighting than eating, with the result that more of the cereal ended up on them than in them. For me, an even bigger problem was that the mother bear's hide was covered with blood and other gore on its underside, so I was immediately covered too, which attracted every biting insect from far and wide. Literally thousands of them converged, and I soon covered such a dense mass of them that I could hardly see the skin of my arms. No-seams, white socks, mosquitoes, you name it, they were there biting away. I'm embarrassed to admit that I couldn't take it. I fled before the enemy. I threw off the mother bear's hide, jumped up, and ran for the cabin, stopping just long enough to wash off in the creek before seeking refuge indoors. During the brief time I had spent under the bear's hide, I had acquired not just hundreds, but apparently thousands of insect bites. Itch, itch, itch. I hadn't succeeded in winning the cubs' trust, much less their affection, but luring them to the food was at least a start. To learn how I did eventually win the cubs' affection and trust, and about all of our fine adventures together, read Beauty Within the Beast. Although it's temporarily out of print, it will soon be available as an ebook on Amazon. One of the first things that any good parent should provide is food. The cubs' access to human food had to be minimized, so they did not become addicted to it as their mother had and suffer the same fate. I wanted them to become fully self-sufficient before they went into hibernation, so they'd continue on their own once they woke up in spring. I led the cubs to sources of fruit, including rose hips, mountain ash, red currant, high bush cranberry, red elderberry, and devil's club. Devil's club is well named for its very sharp thorns, which don't seem to bother the cubs, but sure are held on me when I bumped into them. The cubs also ate devil's club shoots, cow parsnip seeds, and the seed heads of water lily. The cubs were also eager to prey on rodents and birds, but they quickly learned that, unlike berries and seeds, prey fight back. When one cub attacked a beaver, it bit into the cub's cheek and wreaked havoc before escaping. Another cub ended up with a snoot full of porcupine quills. Geese and swans that couldn't escape from the cubs by swimming or flying mauled the cubs with their beaks. Even sandhill cranes could protect their eggs against such small bears, although not as powerfully as eagles did. Of course, the cubs' principal prey had to be fish. When the cubs first took notice of salmon, it was in water so deep that the fish easily escaped. Even where the fish were so abundant that the cubs were literally wading through them, all the salmon they caught were carcasses that had died after spawning. Finally, the whole school of fish resumed their upstream journey, out of the deep pool into a shallow creek. Faced with hundreds of salmon fighting their way upstream, the wildly flopping fish scared the cubs. At first, the only ones they caught were salmon which had become stranded between boulders in shallow water. Nevertheless, the cubs kept chasing fish. Yet even when a cub caught a salmon, the fish was likely to thrash around and escape. Although no salmon ever fought back to defend itself, occasionally one bumped into a bear hard enough to spook its predator. Water in the creek was so shallow that summer that hundreds of salmon were stranded and died on the way. The carcasses provided an enormous feast for the cubs and other wildlife, including eagles and other bears. In latter weeks, the cubs became increasingly skillful at catching live salmon, a skill upon which their lives would depend once they left me behind. Once my cubs had bellies full of fish, they played until exhausted, then cuddled up with me for a long snooze. Well, our wilderness adventures come to an end. Time to ride the current downstream. This is Steve Stringham. Thanks for joining me this evening to learn about the secrets of coexistence with bears. Copies of my books are available on Amazon, currently in hardback and soon as ebooks. Phantom Grizzly will be published in summer 2023. Nearly Breakfast for a Grizzly Bear is due out in the fall. Completion of the Language of Bears book and video will take another year or two. During that time, I will finish analyzing the video footage and other data collected over a period of decades and have cost nearly $1 million in labor and financing. The book and video would document various visible and audible signals made by bears and their interpretation. Anyone who masters this knowledge and skill should be better able to understand whatever bears are trying to tell them, and know how to respond appropriately to assure their own welfare and that of the bears. If you would like to assure completion of this fascinating endeavor, which will require another $50,000 in financing, please donate generously.